This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 47 of Here's How. Posters have always been a key feature of Irish elections. One local councillor wants to have them banned, though. Are political posters an eyesore? Are they environmental pollution or freedom of speech? Listen on.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Councillor Francis Duffy. He's the Green Party councillor on Dublin City Council for Rathfarnham. He was also the unsuccessful candidate for Dublin South West in the general election, but his household wasn't entirely unsuccessful in that election, as well as being Mr. Francis Duffy. You're also Mr. Catherine Martin. You're married to the deputy leader of your party. Am I right, Francis?
Yes, indeed, I am.
All right. Francis, I saw one thing that you promoted, and you're not the first person to do it, but you got quite a bit of publicity, advocating for pretty much completely banning election posters. Why would you want to do that?
Well, it isn't a ban, and maybe the media portrayed it like that. The motion, and others have put motions forward in the past through the Chamber of South Dublin County Council, but the motion actually was to investigate designated poster areas instead of, postering ad infinitum, anywhere you wished. Mm-hmm. So the idea would be that you would have posters or have designated areas. So they may be shopping centres, national schools, churches, or other public spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea
I think
would
I've seen
be
this in France, maybe that the city council puts up a hoarding, and then each party gets one poster each on this hoarding, instead of people going around claiming spaces on lampposts and stuff. Yeah.
So the idea would be everybody gets an equal footing. Now, you might think some of the bigger parties might not like that because they do have more money to spend on postering, and but it got full unanimous support in the council chamber, which I was slightly surprised at. But I did phrase it in such a way that it's an investigation, and we'd roll out some sort of pilot for maybe the 2019 local elections. Mm-hmm. So instead of going hard in at first, it's to try and look at it, investigate it, bring it back to the chamber. I think the Environment SPC they will look at it and then report back to the councillors, hopefully with some pilot that we could roll out in 2019 and see how it works. Okay. And if people are happy with it, then it'd be great.
Okay, I want to separate out those two things there. One is to put up a municipal hoarding whereby each candidate will get a slot to put up their poster, but the other is essentially what I guess would be a legal ban on candidates putting up their posters on lampposts or on ad hoc places wherever they can find. We used to do that in a completely haphazard fashion, but there's been legislation since, and we have essentially a month allotted before each election, which means if you count the Europeans and local elections as one election, they always happen on the same day, and the general election, that means 2 months every 5 years we have posters on lampposts, and that's relatively well respected and enforced. Is that such a terrible thing?
It's something I've been postering since I was in my teens, back to the 80s, and I've enjoyed postering, but back in the 80s it was cardboard boxes and wallpaper paste, and you could only put it in a timber column or post. That's all changed now. You've got zip ties and plastic, and it's gone to a point where South Dublin County Council can have anything up to 35,000 posters put up, and typically most other parties, as far as I'm aware, they just dump their posters when they're finished with them. Now, I have to say I have been recycling mine. I've I've continued to use the posters I have and I take care of them. But that's a lot of plastic being produced and then just skipped. And it's quite a bit of money as well. 100,000 euros probably you're talking for one county. If you multiply that over the country, you're probably talking up to 5 million maybe.
Okay, so but that's 5 million for all the candidates of all the parties, yeah?
Yes, yeah. It's a lot of money and it's a lot of plastic. You know, that's a huge quantity when you think about it of plastic that's being wasted, and it doesn't have much use after it's been used.
Well, they can be, as I say, recycled, and they can be used again. And you can see some parties are careful not to be too precise in the phrasing on the poster to make them perhaps a little bit more generic. But that's what I do. My uneasiness with it is this: that for new candidates, and that would include the Green Party's been around for a long time, but in the sense of people who are not at the centre of, you know, the more powerful parties in the country, access to the media is very, very difficult. Access to really any way of getting through to voters at all is very difficult. But postering, compared to the other ways of contacting the voters, I would have thought is relatively cheap. And 5 million,
not cheap.
Well, it's cheaper.
It's definitely not cheap. Well, I put it this way. Like I've now contested in 4 elections, 2 generals, 1 by-election and a local election. And I've used in total 200 posters because that's all I can afford. And if you're talking small parties, I've never taken any or never been offered any financing from the party in relation to posters. I've put them all up. I've taken them all down. I've paid for the zip ties. It costs quite a bit of money when you're self-funding.
But would you agree that compared to some other budgets, it's not that huge? 5 million divided, as you know, your estimate, divided by about 500 candidates around the country. Yeah. Sure, it's money. It's not peanuts. But compared to the kind of, you know, multi-billion-dollar campaigns that we see happening in the United States, it is absolutely peanuts.
Yeah, but the point is, and you're kind of going slightly wrong on the point, the point is that the larger parties are state-funded and they have, their candidates receive posters for free. They may have to put them up or the parties put them up for them. Now, I know in my constituency, both locally and in a Dáil constituency, you're competing with, for a general election, up to 1,000 posters, and in a local election up to 450. And smaller parties and independents, you know, just don't have that financing, you know, where you've got a big bucket of money from a party's central funding from the government coming back out to their candidates. Where you might say it's unequal, and I can go and spend 10 grand on posters, which I didn't or haven't, and I hope I won't. I don't think I'll need to. That basically, if you've got designated areas across the county, my face is out as many times as the next biggest candidate, if that makes any sense. So if there's, say, 50 designated areas, my face is up 50 times. So is the bigger party's face. Whereas if I'm competing in a general election with 1,000 posters of somebody's face, I can't compete with that. Like 1,000 posters or 2,000 posters, and then I'm trying to think of the cost of that. You're talking anything up to 10 grand. You know, in the general elections I've run in and the locals, I've only spent up to 2.
Sure, I accept that. Even with posters, which are perhaps a bit more democratic than some other ways that other countries do, like buying TV time, even at that, it puts better funded candidates at an advantage, even if it's not as large an advantage as perhaps if you were in the Green Party in the United States trying to compete with $1 billion worth of funding that Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump might have. But I just want to move on to one other aspect of it, which is that I think probably you and I and most people listening to this podcast are political nerds. We know who the candidates in our area are. We know when the elections are coming up. Not everybody does that. There are plenty of people who never watch TV news and never watch never particularly read newspapers. They don't know who the candidates in their area are. They don't know what constituency they live in. They don't know where the boundaries of those constituencies are. And I remember when I was a kid, I noticed an election was happening because posters went up. I noticed where one constituency stopped and another one started because the posters changed. Aren't they an important for educating people who you might call low information voters?
Yeah, but nobody in today's society spends their life in their house. They have to either go to shops or the church or schools or other community facilities. So they move around, so therefore if you populate the constituency correctly, that you are touching all of these bases, then anybody's going to see in a kind of professional kind of manner the candidates that are running in their constituency, not this kind of ad infinitum posters everywhere, overlapping, falling off, covering, railings, which is illegal, and covering traffic signs with, 8x4, huge 8x4 posters.
But do you accept that there's an important, people, there are plenty of people who aren't terribly interested in politics the way I'm not terribly interested in X Factor, but once in a while it's important, and posters alert them to that there's an election on, and there's people, I know lots of people who never pay any attention to politics, but they might watch one or two debates before the election, or they might not, and don't you think it has an important education role? But
I think you're missing the point. If the posters are set up across a constituency in designated areas, then they'll be set up in such a way that everybody's going to see the candidate. If, say, in my case, in the local elections, I had about 180 posters. Mm-hmm. Other candidates the bigger parties would have had twice that at least, and various other leafleting stuff going out, etc., etc. So I don't see the argument where I believe the small person is going to get seen more in this context, whereas if it's all about, you could argue, protecting the bigger parties, because they've got the money to pay for people to put up posters, pay for them to be taken down, so their candidate can go out and canvass. Whereas to date, I've put up and taken down pretty much all of my posters by myself, and put up my wife's and various other people's in the past. It's people seem, well, I don't know, that this, well, I suppose I got a unanimous support from the councillors, which was kind of interesting.
Sure, the people who are already elected want to pull up the ladder, make sure that nobody else gets a look in.
Well, I don't agree, because if say I go out and buy myself 500 posters for the next election, then does that say that I'm going to have more of a chance of getting elected than the person because I have some funding, say, from
No, but you've been getting 5 years of exposure in the media and the resources of the council to use, and you get people like me ringing up you up to interview you. So you've got a huge advantage in terms of exposure compared to somebody who is starting a new party or becoming a candidate for the first time. Of course, it's the existing people are going to want to limit the exposure that anybody else is getting.
But from what I've learned about being in a small party, and I often fought about Renewer and various other upstarting parties, that there's a huge amount of work and background work to make a party work. And I know from being in the Green Party for the last 5 years, we had no funding. We went from 40 staff to 0, effectively. Mm-hmm. And it was run voluntarily.
Because the Green Party lost all their TDs in 2011.
Yes, so you don't get any funding. So you had to live off a shoestring and put your own money into the campaign, which and therefore I couldn't go and finance 500 posters like the other parties were financing for their candidates. The bigger parties. So I still don't understand, I suppose being at the coalface of a small party, you're going to get more representation by designated postering than you will by the postering we have at the minute, because the bigger parties will have at least twice to 3 times the amount of posters a small party will have. So I don't buy the exposure thing, if that makes any sense.
Francis Duffy, Councillor on South Dublin County Council, I got that wrong. Thank you very much for talking to me.
No problem, thank you.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
That's almost the end of episode 47 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 5th of September 2016. There's a link to Francis Duffy's website and other information in the show notes for this podcast on the website. If you can think of a topic that you think should be covered in the next show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook. Please follow on Twitter at Here's How Podcast. Follow Francis Duffy at FN Duffy and subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio or any other podcast app or software. And if you don't know how to do that, there's step-by-step instructions along with contact details at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.